It was a dry, thigh-heavy dawn in the territory just outside Tombstone. The air was already thick with heat that promised to bake the very life from the land. Abel stepped from his small, sturdy cabin, a mug of black coffee steaming in his hand. The old porch would groaned a familiar complaint under the weight of his worn leather boots. He was a man carved from the land itself, quiet, weathered, and deeply rooted. His face was a map of hard years, with lines etched around eyes that had seen too much of the world's noise and now preferred the vast, unending silence of his ranch. The land stretched quiet in every direction, the distant mountains shimmering in the haze, not a single breeze stirring the dust. He had come out to check on his modest herd of cattle, but his mind was on the stagecoach. Weeks ago, after another season of grueling work that left his bones aching with a loneliness as sharp as any physical pain, he'd finally conceded a point to himself. This land was too much for one man. Not the work, he could handle the work. It was the silence. It had once been a comfort, but it was slowly turning into a weight. He didn't need a lover, he didn't need a poet. He needed a partner. A sturdy woman who understood that life out here was about survival, not sentiment. He'd sent a letter and a significant portion of his savings to a matchmaker in St. Louis, his request simple and blunt, seeking a wife. Must be of strong constitution and willing to work. Honesty and a quiet nature are valued above all else. He expected someone plain, perhaps a widow, someone as tired of the world's false promises as he was. The distant rumble and the cloud of dust on the horizon announced the stagecoach's arrival an hour later than scheduled, as if the sun itself were trying to slow down time. He'd ridden his horse, Jericho, into the dusty collection of buildings that passed for a town, tying him outside the general store. He saw them then, the whispers and the poorly concealed grins. Jasper Croft, the son of the wealthiest man in the county, was lounging on the hotel porch with his usual pack of sycophants. They were men whose hands had never been calloused by anything but holding a whiskey glass or a deck of cards. Abel had no time for them, their cruelty as casual and thoughtless as the flick of a cigar ash. He watched them nudge each other, their eyes fixed on the approaching stage. A cold knot tightened in Abel's gut. This was wrong. The stage shuddered to a halt, the driver grumbling about the heat. The door swung open, and the driver called out, "Stone! Your delivery's here." The term delivery struck Abel as odd, impersonal. Then, she appeared. The woman who stepped, or rather, struggled out of the coach was large. Uncommonly so. She was bundled in a thick, shapeless pink dress that looked suffocating in the blistering heat. Her face was round and flushed, her eyes cast down, hidden by the brim of a worn bonnet. She moved with a strange, heavy awkwardness, as if every step was a monumental effort. Behind him, he heard it, a choked-off snort of laughter from Jasper Croft, quickly followed by a chorus of muffled chuckles. The stage driver, a man with a mean-spirited glint in his eye, hopped down and handed Abel a letter. "Payment's all settled," he said, loud enough for the whole street to hear. "Says right here, paid in full. Bride delivered as requested." He winked. "Looks like you got more than you paid for, Stone. A real sturdy 1-inch. The laughter from the porch was louder now, open and mocking. Abel ignored it. His gaze was on the woman, who stood trembling by the coach, her head bowed in what could only be profound shame. He opened the letter. The handwriting was a flamboyant scrawl, entirely different from the prim script of the matchmaker he'd been corresponding with. "Mr. Stone, we trust this specimen meets your requirements for a sturdier partner. We took the liberty of ensuring she was well fed for the journey. A woman of her impressive constitution will surely be an asset to your ranch. Consider our debt for that poker game settled. Enjoy your purchase. Friends of a prosperous Tombstone." It wasn't from the matchmaker. It was from them. From Croft. This wasn't a marriage, it was a prank. A cruel, elaborate, and public joke at his expense, and at the expense of this poor woman who was now the center of its humiliating punchline. Abel's anger wasn't hot and explosive. It was a cold, deep, and terrifying thing that settled in his bones. He looked from the letter to the cackling men on the porch, then back to the woman who refused to look up. He saw not the shape of her body, but the tremor in her hands. He saw not the joke, but the victim. He folded the letter with deliberate slowness, tucked it into his pocket, and walked toward her, his steps even and sure. The town held its breath, waiting for the explosion, for him to yell, to reject her, to send her back in disgrace. He stopped in front of her. He said, his voice low and steady, cutting through the jeers. The sun is fierce. My wagon is over here. Let me take your things. She flinched, as if expecting a blow. Slowly, she lifted her head. Her eyes, when he finally saw them, were a startling shade of brown, and they were filled not with anger or defiance, but with a bone-deep weariness and a terror so profound it made his chest ache. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. He took the heavy, worn valise from her hand and turned to lead her to his wagon, his back straight and unyielding to the renewed waves of laughter that followed them down the street. In that moment, Abel Stone made a silent vow. They had started this joke, but he would be the one to finish it. The ride back to the ranch was shrouded in a silence thicker than the dust their wagon wheels churned up. The woman, who had yet to offer her name, sat hunched on the buckboard seat, her hands clenched in her lap, her gaze fixed on some distant, invisible point on the horizon. Abel didn't press her. He'd been around silence long enough to know it had its own language, and hers was screaming with fear and humiliation. He could feel the heat radiating from her, not just from the sun, but from the layers of heavy fabric she wore. He wondered how she could bear it. The land stretched out around them, vast and empty, a landscape that could either offer solace or magnify one's own desolation. For the two of them, it felt like the latter. When they arrived at the cabin, he helped her down, his hand briefly touching her arm. It felt strangely stiff and unyielding beneath the coarse fabric. The spare room is there, he said, gesturing with his chin toward a door off the main living space. It's simple, but it's clean. The well is out back. You can rest. I've got chores to see to. He left her then, giving her the space he sensed she desperately needed. He worked with a controlled fury, mending a fence post with sharp, angry blows of his hammer, each strike a silent curse on Jasper Croft and his kind. He'd seen their brand of cruelty before, in the war. Men who found sport in the suffering of others, who hid their own emptiness behind loud boasts and vicious humor. He'd thought he'd left that world behind. Now, it had been delivered to his doorstep. For the first few days, she was more like a ghost than a person. She stayed in her room, emerging only when she thought he was outside. He would leave food on the small kitchen table, or a plate of beans and jerky, a piece of fresh bread, and when he returned, it would be gone, the plate cleaned and stacked neatly by the wash basin. He noticed she ate very little, picking at the food as if she had no appetite, which seemed a strange contradiction. He left a bucket of fresh water and a tin cup by her door each morning. He never crossed the threshold of her room, never demanded a single word. This kind of patience was born of a deep respect for another's pain, and maybe a little bit of guilt, too. He was the one who had sent the letter, who had set this chain of events in motion. He was a party to her humiliation, however unwillingly. He started to notice the small things. The way she flinched when he walked too heavily across the floorboards. The way her breath would catch if he came around a corner unexpectedly. She moved with a constant, exhausting difficulty, her breathing often shallow and labored, especially at the end of the day. One evening, he was cleaning a rifle on the porch as dusk settled, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange. She came to the doorway, a silhouette against the warm lamplight of the cabin. She just stood there, watching him, her form bulky and indistinct. "You haven't sent me back," she said, her voice a soft, raspy whisper, as if it hadn't been used in a long time. Abel didn't look up from his work, continuing to slide the oiled rag down the barrel. "No reason to," he replied, his tone even. "Stagecoach won't be back for a week." Most men would have, she stated, a simple, sad fact. He paused, his hand stilling. He finally looked up, meeting her shadowed gaze. His voice was low, like he was talking more to the fading light than to her. "I ain't most men." That was it. No grand speeches, no reassurances. Just that simple, solid statement. he saw her shoulders sag just a little, a fraction of the immense tension leaving her body. She retreated back into the cabin without another word. Over the next week, a fragile routine began to form. She started helping, sweeping the cabin floor, washing the dishes without being asked. One morning, he caught her humming a quiet, mournful tune as she fed the chickens. It wasn't a happy sound, but it was a sound. A real, human sound from someone who had been nothing but a vessel of silence. And in that moment, he realized this wasn't about righting a wrong or getting revenge on Croft. It was about watching a soul try to find its footing on the edge of a pit that nobody else could see. The breaking point came on an afternoon in the second week. The heat had been building for days, a malevolent, living thing that pressed down from a cloudless sky. Abel was returning from the far pasture when he saw her. She had been attempting to draw water from the well, but was now slumped against its stone base, the bucket lying on its side. He ran, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Her face was as white as bleached bone, her lips tinged with blue. Her breathing was a desperate, ragged gasp. Heat stroke, and a bad case of it. Rose, he said, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. He had overheard the stage driver use it mockingly, but he said it now with a gentleness that surprised even himself. Rose, can you hear me? Her eyes fluttered open, but they were unfocused, lost. He knew he had to get her out of the sun and out of that coffin of a dress. He half carried, half dragged her into the cool shade of the cabin and laid her on the cot in her room. I need to get you out of these clothes, he said, his voice urgent. They're killing you. She made a small, protesting sound, her hands weakly trying to push him away. No, please? I'm not asking, he said, his tone firm but not unkind. It's this or you die. He worked quickly, his practical nature taking over. He started with the buttons at her collar, his calloused fingers fumbling with the tiny fastenings. The fabric was thick, far thicker than it had any right to be, and stiff. As he worked his way down, he felt something hard and lumpy beneath the surface. It wasn't the soft flesh of a large woman. It was something else. With a final pull, he opened the front of the dress. And his world tilted on its axis. What he saw shattered him. It broke something deep inside him, a part of him that still held onto some sliver of faith in human decency. Underneath the dress was not a woman of impressive constitution. Underneath was a complex and cruel architecture of torture. She was wearing a thick, quilted undervest, like a piece of armor, stuffed with sand and rags to create bulk. More quilted layers were wrapped around her waist and legs, all meticulously stitched to create a convincing, yet monstrous, silhouette. The dress itself had weights, small canvas bags filled with lead shot, sewn discreetly into the hems and seams, pulling it down, forcing her to labor under an unseen burden. He ripped away the outer dress, then began to unlace the suffocating vest. As he finally pulled the last of the padding away, the truth was laid bare. The woman beneath it all was emaciated. Her ribs stood out in sharp relief, her collarbones like shells on her narrow frame. Her skin, pale and clammy, was covered in angry red welts and deep, chafing bruises where the weighted garments had rubbed her raw. She was starving, weak, a prisoner inside a costume designed by monsters. The cruel joke wasn't that they had sent him a fat bride. The joke was so much more sadistic, so much more depraved. They had sent him a woman they were actively, deliberately torturing, and they had made him the final, unwitting piece of their game. He stared at her frail, bruised form, and the cold anger inside him began to boil. It was a slow, rising tide of pure, unadulterated rage. This wasn't a prank. This was a crime so vile he had no name for it. He gently touched a raw sore on her shoulder, and she whimpered in her delirium. He looked at his own large, strong hands, hands that had built and mended and fought. And he knew, with a certainty that echoed in the deepest part of his soul, that they would now be used to tear Jasper Croft's world apart. He worked through the night, a quiet, methodical fury guiding his hands. He fetched cool water from the well, gently bathing the raw, chafed skin on Rose's back and shoulders. He cleaned the sores with a gentleness he didn't know he possessed, applying a soothing salve he kept for the livestock. Each angry red mark was a testament to a cruelty so profound it sickened him. He found a soft, clean nightshirt of his own and carefully dressed her in it. The fabric, though large on her thin frame, was at least breathable. He forced sips of water between her cracked lips until her breathing evened out and the feverish heat began to recede from her skin. He sat in a chair beside her cot as she finally fell into a deep, exhausted sleep, the first truly restful sleep she'd likely had in months. The cabin was silent, save for the chirp of crickets outside and the soft crackle of the low-burning fire. In the flickering light, Abel examined the terrible costume, now piled in a corner of the room like the shed skin of some monstrous creature. He picked up the heavy dress, feeling the lead weights in the hem. He ran his hand over the sand-filled vest. It was a masterpiece of malevolence, expertly crafted to inflict maximum suffering while maintaining the illusion. This took time. This took planning. This wasn't a spontaneous act of meanness, it was a calculated campaign of dehumanization. When dawn broke, painting the eastern sky in soft strokes of grey and pink, Rose was awake. She was propped up on one elbow, her brown eyes clear and lucid for the first time. They were also filled with a new kind of fear, the fear of a secret revealed. She stared at the pile of discarded clothing, then at him. "You know," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Abel simply nodded, his face grim. "I know." He pulled the chair closer and sat, leaning forward with his forearms on his knees. "Rose," he began, then stopped. "Is that your name?" She shook her head, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. "It's Annabelle. They called me Rose. Like some prize hog." The name Annabelle hung in the air, a small, beautiful thing in a room that had been filled with so much ugliness. "Annabelle," he repeated softly. He didn't ask her to explain. He didn't demand answers. He just waited. And in the quiet safety of the dawnlit cabin, the silence finally broke. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried like a gunshot. She told him what had happened. Not all at once, but in broken fragments, the story spilling out like water from a cracked dam. She was an orphan from back east, with no family and no prospects. She had answered an advertisement for a governor's position in a wealthy household in Tucson, placed by Jasper Croft's father. It was all a lie. When she arrived, there was no position. She was a penniless girl, alone and trapped hundreds of miles from anything she knew. Jasper and his friends saw her as a plaything. At first, it was small cruelties. Then the game began. They made a wager or a sick, twisted bet on human misery. They would create the most undesirable mail-order bride imaginable and send her to the most reclusive, hard-bitten rancher they could find, Abel Stone. The bet was twofold: would he be so desperate that he'd actually keep her, or would he send her back, completing her public humiliation? To ensure the prank was unforgettable, they devised the weighted clothing. They starved her, giving her just enough to keep her alive, while forcing her to wear the suffocating, heavy garments day and night. They told her that if she refused, or if she told anyone, they would see her thrown in jail for vagrancy or worse. She believed them. Who would ever take the word of a nobody like her against the son of the most powerful man in the county? She spoke of the journey, of the stage driver who was in on the joke, of the constant pain and the suffocating heat, of the unending shame. The letter Abel had received was the final flourish, a way for Croft to collect on a poker debt and have a laugh at the same time. He said no man would ever want me," she whispered, her voice finally breaking. "He wanted to prove it. He wanted to prove I was worthless." Abel didn't speak for a long time. He just stared at the fire, his knuckles white where he gripped his knees. Inside him, the boiling rage had cooled, solidifying into something harder and far more dangerous: purpose. He'd fought in a war, seen men gutted and left for the crows in muddy fields. He'd watched death and despair in 100 different forms. But nothing had ever felt as profoundly evil as this. This wasn't the chaos of a battlefield. This was the meticulous, deliberate dismantling of a human being for sport. And it was happening right here, under the same sun, under the same flag he had once shed blood to defend. Annabelle watched him, her breathing shallow, waiting for his verdict. waiting for him to say it was too much for him to cast her out. But he didn't. He rose from his chair, walked over to the small writing desk in the corner, and pulled out a piece of paper, a bottle of ink, and a pen. He stood there for a moment, his broad back to her, and when he turned around, there was ink on his fingers. He didn't hold up a gun. He didn't make a threat. He held up a letter. "I know a man," he said, his voice a low rumble. "A U.S. Marshal named Corrigan. He's not a man who appreciates a joke. He didn't need fists or bullets, not yet. He needed proof. Annabelle's story, her scars, and the monstrous costume in the corner were all the proof a man like Corrigan would ever need. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, a flicker of something that wasn't terror appeared in her eyes. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was smaller than that. It was the simple, staggering realization that someone had listened. That someone believed her pain was worth writing down. That was a start. A week later, the desert gave them a visitor. It was not the marshal. Not yet. This one rode in close to sundown, a trio of riders kicking up a plume of dust that glowed orange in the setting sun. At their head was Jasper Croft, sitting on his fine black stallion as if it were a throne. He rode with an unearned arrogance, a smirk already playing on his lips. Abel spotted them from the porch, where he'd been sharpening an axe blade. He felt that old, familiar tension crawl back into his chest, the quiet hum of impending violence. Trouble had a way of announcing itself without ever saying a word. Annabelle, who had been gaining a little strength each day, was inside. She saw them through the window, and all the color drained from her face. She shrank back into the shadows, her body trembling. Croft reined in his horse a few yards from the cabin, his two cronies fanning out beside him. "Stone," he called out, his voice dripping with condescending cheer. "We were just in the neighborhood and thought we'd check on the happy couple. How's married life treating you? Having a hard time keeping the pantry stocked?" His friends chuckled, a harsh, ugly sound in the evening stillness. Abel didn't move. He laid the axe down slowly, deliberately, and leaned against the porch post, his hands loose at his sides. He was a statue of quiet menace. "You're not in the neighborhood, Croft. You're on my land. State your business and get off it." Croft's smirk widened. "Business? This is a social call. I came to see if you're enjoying my gift. Or have you sent it packing already? We have a wager to settle, you see. I bet my friends here you'd last at least a month before you couldn't stand the sight of that so." That was the word that did it. Sow. It was enough to make Abel's vision narrow to a fine point. He offered them no more words, just stood there in that unnerving quiet way of his, waiting for them to make the next move. They did. Croft dismounted, his boots hitting the dirt with a soft thud. He swaggered toward the cabin door. "What's the matter, Rose? You're not going to come out and greet your benefactors? Don't be shy." He reached for the door. That was when Abel moved. There was no shouting, no dramatic showdown. It was a blur of pure, economical violence. He launched himself off the porch, not at Croft, but at the man on his right, driving a fist into the man's throat. As the man gagged and fell from his horse, Abel pivoted, grabbing a half-full water bucket from the porch and flinging its contents into the face of the second rider, momentarily blinding him. Croft, stunned by the suddenness of the attack, was reaching for his pistol when Abel crashed into him. It wasn't a fist fight, it was a dismantling. Abel, a man hardened by years of relentless physical labor, moved with a strength and fury that Croft, softened by a life of leisure, could not comprehend. A sharp blow broke Croft's nose. Another sent his pistol flying into the dust. Within moments, Croft was on the ground, gasping for air, his face a mask of blood and disbelief. His two cronies were dispatched with similar, brutal efficiency. Abel wasn't looking to kill, only to end it. "Quick!" He dragged the three men, one by one, into the main room of his cabin, their wrists bound tightly with rope he cut from his saddle. Annabelle watched from the corner, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide. She didn't cheer, didn't smile. She just watched in stunned silence as the man she thought was only quiet and kind revealed a capacity for fierce, protective rage she never could have imagined. Someone was finally, truly, standing between her and the men who had treated her life like a coin to be tossed. Abel gagged them, shoving rags in their mouths to silence their muffled threats and curses. He dragged them back outside and tied Croft to the very porch post he had been leaning against moments before. The other two he tied to the wheels of his wagon. The desert has its own way of punishing arrogance. Men like these came out here thinking they owned everything, that their money and names made them kings. But out here, under the vast, indifferent sky, the land and the silence always collect their debts. He knew Marshal Corrigan and his deputies were due to pass through on their circuit within a day or two. They would get his letter. And now, they would get their proof. Flesh and blood this time, still breathing and gift-wrapped for justice. When dawn came, Marshal Corrigan and two deputies did indeed ride in, a dust cloud trailing behind them like a solemn announcement. Corrigan was a tall, lean man with eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He read Abel's letter, his expression growing grimmer with each line. Then he looked at the three men tied and beaten, and at the bruised, thin young woman who stood silently in the cabin doorway. He walked into the cabin and Abel showed him the weighted clothing. The marshal touched the cruel contraption with a look of utter disgust. He didn't need any more convincing. They took Croft and his men without question, hauling them onto their horses like sacks of grain. As they prepared to leave, Corrigan turned to Abel. "You could be in a mess of trouble for this, Stone." "Assault." Abel just looked at him. "Some things are worth the trouble, Marshal." Corrigan held his gaze for a long moment, then gave a slow, respectful nod. "That they are." He turned to Annabelle. "You'll need to come to Tucson to give a formal statement." Annabelle looked at Abel, a flicker of her old fear returning. Abel stepped forward. "She'll be there," he said. "And I'll be with her." She stood in the doorway and watched as the horsemen disappeared into the shimmering horizon, taking with them the source of her nightmares. For the first time, she felt the immense weight on her shoulders, a burden far heavier than any weighted dress, begin to lift. The fight was no longer hers to carry alone. The days that followed were different. The silence that returned to the ranch was no longer heavy with unspoken fear, it was a peaceful, healing balm. There was no more waiting for the sound of boots on the porch or the sight of shadows in the window. Annabelle cooked, her appetite slowly returning. She worked the land beside Abel, her body growing stronger each day. She even laughed once, a real, bright sound that surprised them both, when one of the chickens managed to steal a biscuit right out of Abel's hand. He didn't say much, just went about his chores, but he found himself watching her, not as the victim he had rescued, but as the strong, resilient woman she was becoming. One evening, they sat by the fire, in the very same spot where she had once whispered her broken story. The flames danced, casting warm shadows on the cabin walls. "I want to stay," she said, her voice clear and steady. She looked at him, her brown eyes reflecting the firelight. "Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because this feels like the first place that has ever been a home. The first place I've been given a choice." Abel didn't reply right away. He tossed another log onto the fire, watching the sparks fly up into the dark. He then turned to her and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a nod that said more than a dozen words. It said, "This is your home, too. The choice is yours." Out on that lonely ranch, miles from the noise of politics and greed, two solitary people discovered that healing doesn't always come like a thunderstorm. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the sound of water boiling for coffee, in the shared work of a long day, in a scar that slowly begins to fade. And maybe the cruel jokes and terrible scars we carry, no matter how deep, are not the end of our story. Maybe they are just the proof that we survived, that we kept walking until we found a place where kindness was waiting.